Wind tears across a ridge overlooking the East China Sea. The rain stings like needles. Marines press themselves into the mud as a hillside ahead of them, calm only seconds before, suddenly erupts in flame. Hidden artillery, buried deep inside a honeycomb of Japanese tunnels, roars to life. Men disappear into clouds of rock and smoke. The ground itself seems to scream. It is April 1945, and Okinawa, an island barely 70 miles long, has become the setting for the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Before it is over, it will claim more lives than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. To the young Americans crawling forward through the mud, this tiny island is more than another objective. It is the last barrier before mainland Japan. And to Japanese commanders, it is the final chance to make the United States bleed so badly that Washington hesitates, and perhaps accepts a negotiated peace. What unfolded over the next 82 days was not just a battle. It was a brutal calculation, one that would help push America toward the darkest decision in military history. In the spring of 1945, American planners knew the war was entering its final chapter. Iwo Jima had fallen after 5 weeks of carnage. The Philippines were nearly secured. And yet, Japan had shown no sign of surrendering. Instead, its forces seemed to fight more ferociously, with every mile the Allies advanced. But one location stood between the U.S. and the Japanese home islands: Okinawa. Okinawa was unlike any battlefield that had come before. Nearly 500,000 civilians lived there. Its geographers, steep ridges, limestone cliffs, and deep caves created natural fortresses. And its location, just 350 miles from Kyushu, made it essential for the planned invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall. The stakes were unmistakable. If the U.S. took Okinawa, they'd have a staging ground for the final assault. If Japan held it, they might inflict such horrific losses that America would think twice about launching that invasion. And so, for both nations, Okinawa was no longer just a place on the map. It was a crossroads, the line between survival and annihilation. American commanders had studied Japanese tactics from earlier battles: the relentless banzai charges, the aggressive attempts to push Marines back into the sea. But Okinawa would be different. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, the Japanese commander on the island, understood that frontal assaults were suicide. Instead, he crafted a strategy based not on bravery, but on attrition. He ordered his men to disappear. When the U.S. fleet arrived off Okinawa on Easter Sunday, April 1st, they braced for the kind of hellish beach landings that had defined Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Tens of thousands of Marines expected to be met by a wall of fire. Yet the beaches were quiet. Too quiet. Marines advanced inland, unopposed. They joked that something felt wrong, like walking into an empty house when you know someone is hiding behind the door. That uneasy calm would soon shatter. The Japanese had withdrawn into the southern third of the island, a labyrinth of underground tunnels and fortified ridges. From there, they would let the Americans come to them. And then they would bleed them. While infantry waited underground, Japan's most desperate weapon took to the skies. From airstrips across Kyushu, waves of kamikaze pilots, many barely trained teenagers, strapped themselves into aircraft for one-way missions. Their target, the U.S. fleet, off Okinawa. What began as a trickle became a relentless storm. Destroyers were struck in broad daylight. Support ships erupted into pillars of fire. One battleship endured 5 separate suicide attacks in a single afternoon. The men aboard those vessels experienced a kind of living nightmare watching a plane dive toward them, hearing the rising whine of an engine, knowing they had only seconds to fire. And that one mistake could mean death for hundreds. Over the course of the battle, nearly 2,000 kamikazes hurled themselves at the U.S. Navy. It was the most concentrated suicide campaign in military history. Their impact was devastating. 36 American ships were sunk. 368 were damaged, and over 4,900 sailors were killed. More American sailors died at Okinawa than in any other battle of the Pacific War. Offshore, the sea burned. Onshore, the ground burned. And every hour, the sense grew that Japan was willing to sacrifice everything, even its children, to avoid defeat. As Marines and soldiers pushed south, they encountered the real heart of Japan's defense: the Shuri Line. This was not a single trench or bunker. It was an interconnected network of tunnels, concealed artillery, cave systems, machine gun nests, sniper holes, and underground command chambers. Some caverns were so deep that American bombs couldn't reach them. Troops reported hearing voices beneath their feet, the Japanese moving through tunnels like ghosts. As progress slowed to a crawl, each ridge became a battlefield unto itself: Kakazu Ridge, Maida Escarpment, Sugarloaf Hill. names that, to the men who fought there, became synonyms for hell. One of the fiercest fights occurred at a steep ridge, later immortalized by the story of Medic Desmond Doss. Japanese defenders positioned themselves in a way that forced American troops to climb toward them under constant fire. Men were shot off ropes. Mortar rounds exploded among clusters of bodies. Soldiers recalled that the mud was so thick with blood it was hard to tell where the ridge ended and the wounds began. Doss, refusing to carry a weapon, dragged 75 wounded men from the escarpment's top under enemy fire. His bravery became one of the few bright points in a battle otherwise drowning in darkness. What made Okinawa different from every earlier battle was the presence of civilians. More than 450,000 of them. They lived in villages, farmed to hillsides, and often had no way to flee the combat zones. Many were trapped in caves, the Japanese militarized. Soldiers frequently forced civilians to stay with them, believing it would deter American attacks. Well, they didn't. Artillery, white phosphorus, flamethrowers, all were used to root out Japanese troops from hiding places. Civilians suffered the same fate. Some families, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, believed American troops would torture them. They fled into cliffs and caves, refusing evacuation. Others were coerced into mass suicide by Japanese officers, who insisted it was more honorable than surrender. By battle's end, between 100,000 and 150,000 civilians were dead, the greatest civilian toll of any Pacific Island campaign. Their ghosts remain one of the most haunting legacies of Okinawa. As fighting dragged into May, exhaustion set in. The Marines had been in combat since early April. Soldiers of the 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions fought ridge by ridge, gaining yards at the cost of dozens of lives. Supplies struggled through the mud. Tropical diseases spread. Constant rain turned trenches into rivers of filth. Men described Okinawa as a battlefield that felt alive, like the island itself was trying to kill you. The psychological toll became severe. Snipers who fired at medics, booby traps hidden in corpses. Night infiltration attacks, civilians screaming from caves, and the stench of thousands of unburied bodies for many veterans. Okinawa would be remembered not for the enemy they fought, but for the trauma they could never unsee. By late May, American forces finally cracked the Shuri line. General Ushijima knew the battle was lost, but he held to the Japanese military code of Gyokusai, to die honorably rather than surrender. His men launched a final counteroffensive, and then retreated south for a last stand. On June 22nd, after a final ceremony, Ushijima and his chief of staff performed ritual suicide on a rocky cliff overlooking the sea. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning. The numbers from Okinawa stunned the world. 12,500 Americans killed, over 55,000 wounded, up to 150,000 Okinawan civilians dead, and 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed. In total, more than 250,000 people died on an island smaller than many American counties. For American military leaders, the implications were chilling. Okinawa had been defended by just a fraction of the forces Japan had reserved for its home islands, and yet, the bloodshed rivaled the worst battles of World War II. If invading mainland Japan required storming beaches defended by millions of soldiers and civilians. Determined to die fighting? How many American lives would it cost? 200,000. 500,000. 1,000,000. President Truman was handed casualty estimates that seemed almost unthinkable. Suddenly, a new, terrible option, one barely tested, began to move from theoretical to inevitable. Historians have long debated what truly pushed the U.S. toward using atomic weapons on Japan. But in the war rooms of 1945, Okinawa cast a long and dark shadow. The Kamikaze attack showed Japan was willing to send thousands of young men to certain death. The Shuri line showed they'd fortified the homeland into a fortress of caves and hidden guns. And the civilian suicides showed that the Japanese government could coerce its own people into dying for the cause. American planners feared that an invasion of Japan would dwarf Okinawa many times over. When Truman later said, "I made the decision to save lives," the meaning was clear. The lives he referred to were the ones he believed would be lost in another Okinawa, multiplied across the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. Whether one agrees or not, the truth is undeniable. Without Okinawa, Hiroshima and Nagasaki might never have happened. When the guns finally fell silent, Okinawa was a wasteland. Entire villages had been wiped from the map. Families lay buried in collapsed caves. The once beautiful landscape was cratered and charred. Survivors emerged weak, starving, and traumatized. America quickly realized the island would remain essential. Long after the war, Okinawa became home to some of the largest U.S. bases in the Pacific. a reminder of both the sacrifice and the strategic significance of this small island. Today, memorials dot the hillsides. Stone monuments stand where ridges were once soaked in blood. Names American, Japanese, and Okinawan stretch across walls of polished granite. The island remembers, and it asks us to remember, too, because Okinawa was more than a military victory. It was a warning about what happens when nations refuse to surrender, when wars stretch too long, and when ordinary people, soldiers and civilians alike, become trapped in struggles far beyond their control. In April 1945, as America fought its way across Okinawa's ridges, few understood the greater impact of that battle. Yet its echoes shaped the final days of World War II and the future of warfare itself. Okinawa proved that courage has limits, that strategy has consequences, and that the price of victory can sometimes be almost indistinguishable from the price of defeat. And so, the island stands today as both a memorial and a question. How high must the cost climb before nations choose peace? And that concludes our journey into this extraordinary moment in history. If you enjoyed exploring the past with me, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Now it's your turn. What historical event should we uncover next? Share your ideas in the comments below, and your suggestion might be featured in a future video. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep seeking the stories that shaped our world.